All right, thanks for the few people who risked the TBD talk. This is on Backbone.js and sharing code on the client and the server. There are two other talks that will be happening at this conference about a similar topic, so it might be interesting to attend all three and just kind of compare the different implementations. All right, so this talk is titled The Holy Grail, and it's titled that just because this is kind of new grounds. People have been exploring this for a while, and nobody's really found a solution. I'll get into that a little bit later, but to start, my name is Tim Branyen, and I work at a small startup in Boston called Matchbox, and I'm their lead front-end engineer, and I'm working on a single-page client-side application for them. And parts of this talk are actually influenced from some of the work that I've been doing there. But for the most part, we've found that our application, since it's behind a login wall and it requires authentication, that we're not really too keen on running on client and server. So this is more of sort of like a research project of my own, and just kind of experimenting with this new space and just seeing like what are potential best practices that people should be following if they too want to start doing this. And if you would like to follow along, you have your laptop out, the slides are available online. It's at that bit.ly link. It's a little hard to see, so maybe it would be better to just like grab them at the end of the talk. Okay, so what I'll be going over in this talk is what are some of the problems that you're going to be encountering when you try and bring your application that you've written already for the browser and running it onto the server. There are different types of applications, so maybe this isn't even something that you need to do. So I'll be talking about some of the reasons why you may want to actually do this. And I have an example application prepared that I'll run through. And since I actually have plenty of time during this talk, I'll be able to step through the beginning of the application, starting with index.html and working our way through it on the browser, and then going through on the server and seeing what kind of special magic I've had to incorporate into the application to get this to run correctly. So one thing that I put a disclaimer at the bottom here is that nothing in this talk is 100%. It's purely research right now, and there's a lot of discussion that's still going on around what are some of the ways that you can do certain things. I just had a lovely conversation with two of the other guys that are giving talks here. Spike is actually here as well. About just like what are our implementations, and there's a lot of overlap. So it's really interesting that we're kind of converging in some of the same places. I'm also using Backbone.js. It's a great abstraction. It's a code structure library, and I'll get into why I would recommend using something like this. So to start, there's different types of applications that are built, and these are some old slides that I have where I find that they work well just illustrating a point that I would like to make, that you have a single-page application, something that's running purely on the client, where you download a package of JavaScript and CSS, and then all the DOM and HTML gets constructed on the client side instead of the server. This has implications for if you don't have JavaScript enabled, if you're using some sort of device that maybe for accessibility or impairment, you will not be able to render this content. And it may not even be a device. It may just be like a spider that's working for a search engine that can't parse JavaScript correctly, so your page just becomes nothing. The flip side of that is something I like to call a server-side application. And the example that I picked here is GitHub. And the reason why I chose GitHub specifically is because it leads into the next slide that I'm about to show. But GitHub will render their entire markup, everything on the server, so you can disable JavaScript in your browser, hit refresh, and still see and function with the website. So this little diagram I have here, it's a little hard to see because of the contrast, but what we have are two different sides of the spectrum. We have something that I like to call a website, and then something I like to call a web app. And the web app is the single-page application, while the website is the server-side application. And where they converge is right in the middle with that progressive enhancement. And this is what GitHub does. So when you go to GitHub and you refresh the page without JavaScript, it just renders. You do have JavaScript. They will layer an additional functionality, such as push state, so that you can click on links and it will fetch content and then render it without having to reload the entire page. So why am I calling this the Holy Grail? I alluded to that a little bit in the beginning, but really it's just like this is a space that no solution truly exists yet. And maybe there'll be something that comes out this year, maybe next year. What we really need is some way to run our application on the server and using the exact same code, run it on the client. That, in my mind, is this mythical setup that I think everybody would love to have. Let's say you just write your application the way you traditionally would for the browser, and then you could just run node app, and suddenly, here we go. We have an exact copy of that running on the server that we can hit. Now let's talk a little bit about who's consuming your application. I had briefly mentioned like search engines, but there could be just a whole wide spectrum of people that are accessing your content, and you really don't want to prevent them from accessing it. So if you're gearing something, let's say the Boston Globe website, you want that content to be available to everyone who's a paying customer, no matter what device they're running on, whether it's a Kindle, whether or not it's your MacBook Pro, whatever. You have everybody coming in at it. So what I've divided here are just kind of like two of the wide spectrum areas. So you have everyone, you have real people using your application, and then you have possibility of having robots, spiders hitting your application and trying to get the content as well. And then the last two here are kind of more of the environments that your application could be running in and why someone might be consuming it through that. It might be through PhoneGap or Air. So TweetDeck, I don't know if they canceled that as well, but they had like an Adobe Air version as well that you could run on your app, in your desktop. And that's a locked environment, so you can develop your application purely knowing that it's going to run in that environment. It's going to have JavaScript. You're not going to disable JavaScript inside of an Adobe Air frame. The other kind of environment might be like minimum requirements necessary to access your application. So this is kind of like an iffy topic just because the web really should be open and available to everyone, but that may not always be the case. Sometimes you're working on a very modern application that really needs the demands of a modern browser, so you set the minimum requirements necessary in order to run that application. So yeah, the question becomes, do you need server-side rendering? And this is a question where a lot of people are like, yeah, of course, I need that. I would love it. It's, it has more performance. It's going to be more accessible. It's going to have all these great things for me. But at what cost? It's, it's not trivial to do this right now. So you really have to really step back and think, is this something that I need? And it may be something you want to experiment with on your own, because that's definitely fun to kind of explore a new space and figure out better ways of coding such that when you're ready in the future to do something like this, your code's kind of already prepped in that way. So I don't want people making decisions based off of just these performance streams that, yes, this is going to be so much faster. I refresh the page, it's already rendered on the server, it's just going to come right down the pipeline. I wouldn't do that. And I wouldn't do it purely for SEO reasons either. I would really think about it in terms of accessibility, whether or not you're making your content more accessible to the people that really need to use it. And then from there, performance and SEO will come inherently. Those are like a byproduct of the bigger picture of accessibility. And a little joke I have here is, I don't know if you guys know Matt Marquis, he goes by the name Wilto online. He fights for the users, and he worked on the Boston Globe website, and I got into a big argument with him at one point where I felt like, no, that's not necessarily true. You really have great performance with the single page application. But now I'm sort of seeing the other side and some of the work that I'm doing where I really do like the ability of being able to disable JavaScript completely, have the application function. When I talk about the server in this context, I am specifically referring to Node.js. There are other runtimes that run JavaScript on the server. They're not really relevant to this talk. I'm making assumptions purely based off of Node. So really what this should say is Node in the browser. And like I mentioned at the bottom, there's a whole nother talk that could happen about just sharing template fragments or rendering certain parts and accessing routing state within like a Rails application, but outside of the scope. All right, so the biggest and the one takeaway I hope that everyone gets out of this is abstraction is everything. If you can abstract away direct access to the DOM, anytime you need to switch into a new environment that may or may not have the DOM, you can create your own implementation and inject it. So from what I have here, the biggest thing is just abstraction. So think about that with the DOM library. I mentioned before at the beginning about Backbone using a code structure library, so you can somehow abstract away the major high-level concepts of your application, the routing, the models, the collections, the views, all of that gets abstracted away into these nice classes that have prototypes that you can then augment and change based off the environment that you're in. And the top bit here with modules are even more important. I will get into some of the cool shit that you can do with AMD. I've always found that AMD was kind of complicated, that it was too much, that there was wrappers, that there were all these things that you had to do in order to get your application to just work. And now, after doing all of this, I've found that once you kind of figure it out, once it starts making sense, it becomes so powerful. The reason why you have all these wrapping modules where you have, let's say, functions that you enclose all your code in, is that you can then dynamically at runtime change how code behaves. And I'll get into that later. I'm kind of jumping ahead. Some of the main areas of concerns are just like, how do you load your code? So I showed in the beginning how there's differences with loading on the server and the client and our pipe dream about how we can just run one file and then have our code work. Sharing the routing is totally different on the browser and the client. On the client and the server. And you have other things that are different, such as anchors and forms and how those behave on the browser and how you would want them to behave on the server. And then the very last bit is just how you do optimize these API calls that you're making. So when you're on the client, you make an API request, you're using XHR and you're going to make a remote request somewhere. In the case of the example application I have here, the API is actually directly connected to the server, so I can just directly hit that immediately. And it just makes things a lot easier. One other bit that I had skipped over there, and probably my favorite topic, is how do you render views on the client and the server. Okay, so just the easiest bit, the most important piece is how do you load your code. There are two totally different ways of doing this. So on the server side within Node, they use something called CommonJS. And this is a synchronous syntax. And we see here it just has like var app equals require app, and that will synchronously hit the file system, pull out app.js, and then execute that code. And then you have the browser where at the end of the day, it's probably going to end up being a script tag unless you're doing some kind of string fetching and then evaluation on the browser. So this is an asynchronous operation that happens. So it pulls the app.js code and then evals it asynchronously, and you'll have to wait till that's complete before you can do something. So one way that people have been working around these limitations is just having modules and unifying your whole code into working this one way. And I like to say that there's two different types of module formats. There's CommonJS and then there's everything else. Only because of the virtue that CommonJS kind of rules the Node environment, and then everything else is purely for the browser. So Node.js, CommonJS, I have Dojo in here that uses AMD. jQuery has sided with the AMD project as well. And then D3 recently, Bostock had tweeted that he's looking into Browserify, which is kind of like a flavor of CommonJS that's wrapped into James Halliday's tools. So when you go with the module format, and like in this case, I'm specifically referring to AMD, what are you actually doing? So you're including, when you call require jQuery, that's going to be finding a jQuery file somewhere in your pathing for Node, and then it's going to load that file that's respective to it. But what if you don't have jQuery? So like you're on Node, there is really no jQuery that is a direct substitute for what you will have in the browser. You'll have to find some other way of loading in a DOM library. And one of the cool things about AMD is that you can redefine what the definition is. So we can see at the bottom here, I have define jQuery, but yet I'm returning Cheerio, a totally different library that emulates a certain subset of jQuery that's necessary in the browser, inside the server environment. So there's a bunch of custom features that you can do with AMD, and one of these new projects that just came out, I just added this slide in because I've constantly updating my example application to use what I deem best practices, or just stuff that I figured out that is slightly better than the previous way of doing it. And Jen Arp's AMD feature, I'm not too sure how the Wi-Fi is going to work here, so this may or may not load. His project, AMD feature, allows you to have two different modules that kind of act as the same. So the example that he has here is dropdown. So he has this dropdown implementation that differs slightly on iOS from Android. So he created the dropdown-iOS and has the iOS specific dropdown code. Then you have the Android version with the Android specific code. And then you have a third file, which is the actual mediator that figures out which module to actually load. And he has these isAvailable functions, so it tests whether or not this is the feature that we want. So he has implementations for the iOS, Android, and as you can see here, it's an array, and it starts at the top one, and it runs that function. It says, are we in iOS? If we aren't in iOS, it goes down the array to the next one available, and it says, all right, does this one return true? And we can read the comment here, and he goes, if we end up here, we're not on iOS, so we can just return true and use the Android implementation. So I found several problems with this, with his approach. So the first one is that his syntax is too verbose. That array with all the objects in there is kind of very explicit. His test functions aren't absolute, so they're stacked based off of the first one. If it fails, it goes to the next one. If that one fails, it goes for the next one. Instead of having truly unique functions for each one, so that if it matches that, you know this is the correct environment for your code, for that module. And the last bit is he doesn't utilize the requirejs configuration file. So in AMD land, no matter what loader you use, there's always this notion of a configuration that gets passed into the runtime. So as your code runs, you define stuff like, where is my base app? Like, where's the base URL? Where is my application code? What are the paths? So like if I say require jQuery, where does jQuery actually live? You can specify those in the configuration. So what I did is I rewrote his code, kind of taking this idea putting it into a totally different way of loading. And what I came up with was in a declarative fashion, and I'm going to go over in the example application how I actually did this, but just for now so you can kind of think about it. You define features, so we'll have some feature that we want. So maybe this is just setting up the environment. So we have this custom environment for Node and a custom environment for the browser, and just providing certain features in either one, and we only want them to load in the correct spot. So what I did is I made these features, and then I used just the object keys as paths to the modules, and then the values is just a function that tests whether or not you're in either or. And the way that I've set this up is that you have to be absolute. There always has to be something that matches, otherwise it'll either throw an error or the require will fail during the runtime because there's just no module to match it. So my humble recommendation is to use AMD and requirejs if you're going to be running code on both the client and the server, because you can start writing your application logic and setting up your projects now without even thinking about the server in the long term. So if you start using AMD now, you will be able to run your application in some capacity on the server by doing remaps of modules and being able to run that into a V8 environment that's headless. So what I have here is just a sample of what does an AMD module look like. I'm hoping most people here, and if you don't quite understand AMD and requirejs, hopefully this kind of gives you some idea of what you're in store for. So this define function can be defined many different ways. There are many different ways that you can do a definition in AMD. This is just one of them. This is kind of a flavor I like, where you have a module, you pass it in a require function, which you can then use within your application, within that actual code block. And then you just name what your module is, and that is like the exports object that will be returned whenever somebody calls require, whatever this module name is. And the way that this works is requirejs will actually toString the body contents of this function at the runtime. It'll parse out all these require blocks. It'll make sure that those are all required before the code is actually executed. So it gives you this nice kind of like common JS way of writing your modules. If you have ever seen any other ways of defining a module, you may have seen like an array syntax, and then you have to like map it into the function, which is kind of ugly and a little bit distracting. So I would recommend using the common JS approach. So moving on, we have the notion of state and routes. And originally people were doing this approach here, which Google recommended. It was the hashbang notation, where you would give it a fragment at the end whenever you're using your single page application. And then if a search engine that was capable of this hit that, it would redirect to this other URL that would use an escaped fragment, and then your application would have to know how to respond to that and send the correct content. So this is fundamentally broken in so many different ways that it really is kind of frustrating when somebody comes into an IRC chat room and asks for assistance on this, because I feel like there's just so many better ways of doing this. First off, this offers no accessibility. So if you have a device or if you're using a browser that does not have JavaScript enabled, this isn't going to help you at all. This is purely for SEO. And if we go back to that original slide, don't design for SEO. Design for accessibility, and the SEO will follow. And yeah, the server can't read the hashes, so there's no way that you can actually provide that content down. So what I ended up doing is, in Backbone, coming back to why you're using a code structure library, you can actually override the prototype methods that would run on the browser and do browser-specific things. But in the server context, you can actually redefine what these things mean. So in this case, let's say we have the router, which is typically using pushState or location.hash to determine what it is. I'm creating a server using Express, and then I'm overriding the Backbone router prototype route method. And this is actually convenient, but the syntaxes are almost identical. So what I can do is I can just do server.get, whatever that route is, and then run that exact same function inside. The last bit, these are actually the two methods that I override. And this last one right here, start, would kick off the routing inside of Backbone, but instead what I want to do is just call the listen for that server. This is really out of context. I'll show you how this is really working in the application a little bit later. This kind of gives you an idea of where we're taking this. So there's also the notion of a headless solution, and problems with the headless solution. So for those of you who don't know, a headless solution is like when you basically are running an iframe of your application, not in a browser, but headless on like a server inside of a command line somewhere, and it's just running. And you can access all the HTML that's happened. But one of the problems in this fashion is that you don't know when the application's finished, like truly finished. you could be having asynchronous requests that are taking a little bit of time, and you're in this kind of like half state. And this is called the halting problem. You don't know when an application is truly complete. So this is what a few other services are using. I believe Meteor is doing something very similar to this, where they're kind of like scraping out those contents and then they're caching it. Whenever a search engine hits your application, they're going to serve those contents. But this isn't really helping us with accessibility either. So the view rendering, this is a complicated beast. If you have never written code inside of Node before, Node does not have the notion of a DOM, so you don't have document.body, document.head, document.anything. You just don't have that. So you have no luck with that. Do not ever never directly access DOM methods, because this is going to make it a hellish experience inside of Node to try and patch all of those and make them work the way that they're spec'd. So don't use the DOM, use the DOM extraction. And DOM abstraction of choice for most people is jQuery, but jQuery is not available on the server in Node. There is a jQuery package, but that is not true jQuery. That's jQuery running inside of another JS DOM environment that is not identical, and it's not passing all the unit tests. So it's like you can't trust that. So if you start using jQuery, you're going to have this expectation that, oh, it's going to work exactly the same. One thing you're also going to want to do is maintain the same syntax. But you're going to want to abstract. So when you're writing your views, you're not going to want to have to re-implement the same exact views with a slightly different syntax for the server. You're going to want to maintain that in both places. And the last bit, and this is something that I was discussing with those other developers here who are doing similar things, is when do you actually send the contents? So when you're on the server, how do you know when that top level page is finished rendering? You may have a bunch of subviews that are also rendering independently, and you need to know when everything is complete. So I wrote a library called Layout Manager, and I don't know if anybody here has heard of that, but it's a Backbone View specific plugin that runs on both the client and the server. And as of recently, it has full unit test coverage inside of Node as well. So our syntax is maintained one-to-one from the browser and the server. This compatibility was done by Juggling Mike Panisi, who works at Boku. And he put a lot of time into this to make sure that our code, he's very adamant that our code needs to work in both places exactly the same. Otherwise, why bother using this? An example of what an identical syntax looks like is right here. So the documentation explains how all of this stuff works. This is just a very simplistic example of creating a backbone view. We call them layouts to differentiate the two. And you can specify a template property that's a function. It could be string contents, and then you can work with that. But here I'm just using _templates, and I'm just calling the text my page template, and when I call render, our output will be my page template. This will work identical on both client and the server. And the way that we do this is we use a library called Cheerio underneath the hood, and Cheerio offers a lightweight abstraction over the jQuery API. It doesn't try and emulate the DOM, it tries to emulate jQuery. And it also has a sub-module underneath Cheerio called Node.html parser, which is a kind of like a loose and very forgiving HTML parser that's incredibly fast. We provide patches and fixes to both of these libraries to sort of maintain the integrity and code quality that we expect with Layout Manager. So I do not hesitate to recommend using Layout Manager in production for your application. Some of the techniques in here, I would ward you away from going into the production route, but at least with Layout Manager specifically, we find that this works very stable. One of the future improvements, and something I've experimented with, and I'll show you a work in progress branch that I'm on, is stopping rendering from happening twice. So you're running the exact same application on the server and the client. So you've rendered it on the server, you've loaded the application for the first time on the page, but now your application is running again on the client. How does it know not to re-render a second time? Because it's already rendered once on the server, now it's going to slap it again. You're going to get a bit of a flicker. I use optimized builds that are very synchronous, so the flicker is very minimal, but there are times I've noticed it, and I've come up with a way of fixing that. On the client, what I do is I override the render method, and I search for a data attribute that gets sent from the server. It's on the element. I can check to see, okay, does this have a render attribute? Remove that render attribute, so set it to false so that we don't hit this again. In case we need to re-render that view, we don't want to ever stop it from being able to be re-rendered. So I remove that, and then I call return early, so it never actually applies that content. And I'll show you this in context, how that will work on render. And then on the server, what I do is I just add this one line where I say data render is true, and this is in the server-specific implementation of that one method, and then it just renders the exact same way. Another issue that we have is that of forms and anchors. Specifically with anchors, I hijack them. So I use absolute links so that if you don't have JavaScript enabled, you can still access all these pages. I don't render them with hashes. And then what I do is I have this little simple jQuery that will run through. It'll find links that are probably going to be routed through our application. It looks specifically for relative ones. And then it prevents default so that it doesn't actually change the page. You stay on this page. And then it will navigate it through the backbone history. And the last bit is optimizing your API calls. So instead of using Ajax and emulating Ajax and trying to do all of this on the server, which some other people are doing, I would prefer to directly hit the API. So Backbone offers this kind of single method where all data comes from. So when you call fetch on a model to actually populate it with your server's model data, it all goes through this one function called sync. And sync can be implemented on specific models and specific collections at that level. So in this case, for my display model, I'm going out and I'm checking, hey, is this a read? Okay, it's a read. Let's go to the API and get the file by the ID that's being provided on this model, and then set the contents directly inside of that model. So others are doing, like I mentioned before, Meteor's doing Headless. Airbnb will be releasing render at the end of the day, discussing that. Photos Near Me is a throwback to Eric Ferrilio of Yahoo. He works on the UE team. And I used to have long discussions with him about rendering on the client and the server and the technical problems. He gave a great talk on his app called Photos Near Me, which uses UE 3, and it renders it on the client and the server. And then SoundCloud, I'm not really sure what they're doing. They're doing something that allows it to work, so that's kind of a black box for me. So we're not quite at the questions yet. Let's take a look at this example application that I've been talking about. So it's called Preview Code, and it's at previewcode.com. And this is a very basic application that serves really just to illustrate the point of having something that runs on the client and the server, uses a plugin that is only available on the client called Prism, which was written by Leah Veru, which does syntax highlighting. So the point of this application is that you can drop files into it, and then you can share this link with other people. So I'm going to zoom out of the full screen here so you can see the URL change and everything. I currently have JavaScript enabled, so we're going to see how this app ideally functions, and then we'll see what some of the limitations are when we disable JavaScript. So I'm going to grab some files here, and I'm going to drag them into this application, and I'm going to wait because it's doing some uploading. And there we see that the URL is now changed, and this is now a permanent link. This uses push state, and now I can click through all of these and see what the files look like. You notice that the page is not refreshing. I can click back and we get all this nice history state management. I'm actually really impressed that this didn't break. This demo is broken every time I've given this talk, and it's it's great. Okay, so now that we see that this is working, everything seems to be fine, let's disable JavaScript and see how much breaks. So I'm going to disable JavaScript and I'm going to hit refresh. Oh no, okay, let's try refresh again. Come on, let's go back to just the first one. So this always seems to happen to me, is that there'll be some kind of little hiccup. So that's probably a bug with just using that subroute. But here we are at the top level. And we see that the syntax highlighting is no longer there. And yeah, there's a bug with that sub-level. But the point being is that we actually get access to these contents. Even though it's not syntax highlighted, you can still access the page. We can still go back to the original. So here I am on the home page, and we see that JavaScript is not running at all. It's just the CSS, and it's being server rendered here. Another issue is that I have this add files here spot, which is using drag and drop features of the browser, those drag and drop events. Those aren't available inside of browsers that don't have JavaScript enabled. So what I should be doing in the future is swapping this out, or actually defaulting to a file input, and then allow people to select files that way, and then using JavaScript in the browser to replace it with this drag and drop. So that will be a future improvement as part of like the differences between forms on the client and the server. All right, so let's re-enable JavaScript again. And go back to one of those, these files. And then when I hit refresh, now we see it's kicked in and it's got the syntax highlighting again. And the application does work when it has JavaScript enabled on it. So I'll look into that bug. And if anybody wants to look at the GitHub page and try and help me fix that later on, it's tbranyen/previewcode. And all the sources up here, I have all the directions in order to get it running locally. So this project utilizes grunt and Node, like I mentioned. So in order to get started, you simply clone this down, cd into the directory, use npm, which is bundled with Node. That installs all the dependencies that you need to run this application. Optionally, you can install grunt CLI. This gives you access to the grunt executable on the command line, the CLI tool, and I'll actually go through this. So preview code. So npm install has already been completed on here. Now we have the grunt CLI. Now I can run grunt redis and server, and that will run this locally. And then I can go to localhost 8000. Let me make sure that that's not secure. And here we have it running. So by default, this uses AMD, which we're going to see a plethora of jQuery getting pulled, or JavaScript being pulled down, and CSS. This is being built off of one of my projects called Backbone Boilerplate, and it provides a set of grunt tasks that help you write modern web applications. So you can do things like write all of your CSS in, or link all your CSS in one file. So let's take a look at that, index.css. And you'll see here that I'm pulling HTML5 boilerplate, just two specific files that I want out of that. I'm pulling in the Prism styles, and I'm pulling in all my application style sheets. And you'll notice that I'm using the .style extension. So this Backbone Boilerplate stuff gives you on-the-fly compilation of stylists and less. So if I look in here, I'm using like nib to do vendor prefixing and all of these styles. And when I look at it in the browser, so when I go to one of these, we can see that it's just rendered as regular CSS. So there's some really cool stuff that's kind of tangentially related to this talk. And when I'm ready to actually build that, I can do grunt release, and we'll see here that it's compiling everything. It's just compiled all the styles, and it's minified all those styles as well. So this application can be highly optimized. This entire preview code sits at around 0.5 MB uncompressed. When it's compressed and served down with gzip, it goes down to 51 kilobytes, which is obviously more geared towards what we would like to see. So let's step through this application and see how this functions. One of the things I'm boasting here is that you write the application once and then it runs in both places. You write it for the browser and then you think about the server. My ideas and opinions on this are kind of changing a little bit, only in the sense that you should be thinking, forward thinking about how can we write our application such that moving it to the server is not problematic. Okay, so let's go into index.html, and we'll start with just the browser side. Like let's assume at the moment that the server is not even related to this. How would this application run? So we start with a call to source.js, and I do these things virtual mappings. So if we look inside of the grunt config, and the grunt configuration is just what powers grunt. It's a declarative way of telling it what to do. I have a server section in here. And the server section has this object called map. And we see here that whenever you run my grunt server and you hit source.js, it's going to redirect to the require.js script. So this is effectively the same thing as writing vendor.js require.js inside of here. The reason why I do this virtual mapping is that once I've concatenated and I built out the entire application and I'm pushing it to my server, I don't want it to be called required.js anymore because now it's my full application, and I don't want to have to rewrite the index.html. I don't want there to be any sort of process that changes index.html. Index.html never changes in this application. So we use virtual mappings in order to achieve this. So source.js at the moment in the browser is effectively requirejs, and requirejs searches for this data main attribute on that script called appconfig. So it's going to now load the browser configuration file, which is actually shared with the server as well. So it's treating it as if it's a browser-based. So this does things like pathing. It makes it easier. Instead of having to type /vendor, I can alias it. I'm also aliasing my feature plugin that I wrote, and I'll get into that. And I have to do this thing called shim because AMD only works, or requirejs only works with AMD. This is a feature that was added that allows you to load non-standard code into it, non-standard AMD code. So Prism, Leia's library, is not AMD compatible, but I can still load it in by specifying what the exports variable is. This is effectively saying whenever I call require vendor.js Prism, load window.prism instead. Give me that object. So I'm doing some other funky stuff in here, and I have a lot of to-dos and fix-me's that just sort of remind me and show anybody else who's looking at the code there is a better way of doing this. I'm still in conversations with James Burke, who wrote requirejs, about having multiple configuration files. So this project uses this package manager called jam.js, and jam.js allows you to put AMD-compatible code into this nice repository, and it knows how to trace dependencies because it's using AMD. So when I install, let's say, a Backbone plugin, it can ensure that, okay, do you have Backbone installed in your application already? Oh, you don't. Let's go and fetch Backbone and make sure that the compatible version is in here as well. And it's great because now I can track all of these dependencies inside of my package.json. Right down here, you see I have 3 dependencies to run this application: Backbone, jQuery, and Layout Manager. And because I have these specified here, they no longer have to be thought about. Like whenever something new comes out, I can just do jam upgrade and get all these latest versions. So that's another handy feature of using AMD and require. Anyway, so getting back on topic, requirejs does not allow you to have multiple configurations, and Jam maintains its own dynamic configuration, so you don't have to manually specify all these things. What I do is I use the shim to say, whenever I load my main application, make sure that the jam.js require configuration is loaded as well. Okay, and then at the end of this, we get into that feature plugin I was talking about. So I'm using the features purely in order to load either requirements for the browser or requirements for Node. So these separate environments get checked with that is available function. So for the browser, I check to see if there's a window object, because a window object does not exist inside of Node.js. In Node, I check for a process object, which hopefully does not exist in the browser. And just to make sure, extra sure, I do process title equals Node. So if those 2 things are true, I know I'm in a Node environment. And then the last bit is just setting up the dependencies and saying, okay, once the config is done, so once this config is done loading, now load the main. And then main will go out and it will load the jam configuration. So this is kind of convoluted and a little bit complex, but as you start working with AMD and requirejs, most of this stuff becomes sort of standard. All right, so that's the browser, and then it hits this main function. Main will load the application, which the application is simply an object that's shared throughout the rest of the app. It sets up things, we can take a look at that. This just sets up that link hijacking that I was talking about, and sets up a root option, so in case you want to run this application under like a subfolder, you could change that here and make sure the application reflects that correctly. So there's not too much in there, but the main thing here is that I'm doing require feature environment. So feature bang is saying use the feature plugin in requirejs and load that environment section. So that environment section is now being executed here, and it's going to go through each function and then figure out which one passes the test, and then to load that environment module instead. So this is incredibly useful because now I can have these 2 environments here, browser, which we can see here uses the window object and uses jQuery get to do Ajax, which we're not going to want in the server. But yet if we're in Node and it loads that instead, it's going to use the file system module, it's going to use Cheerio, and it's going to assign backbone.dollar, which is its DOM abstraction, to use Cheerio and load in the index.html file as our base template. So it's going to treat that as if it's their document root. Okay, so we have all of this, and hopefully this makes sense at this point. You can have independent environments that are loaded based off of where you're currently executing the code. So let's just keep going through this real quick. There's a bunch of different modules in here. The big one that I want to show is the display one, which is where Prism gets loaded. So we load Prism on the browser, and then what it does when it actually needs to use it, it checks, is Prism an object and is it truthy? Actually, it just checks whether or not it's truthy. And if it is truthy, actually use that plugin. Okay, so that's the browser. And there's a lot there. Let's check and see how does the flow differ when we get into the server. So for the server, inside of the grunt config, I have this function called server, and if you provide this property and you give it a function that returns an express server, it'll use it internally instead of its own. And the reason why I'm doing it this way instead of writing a completely separate file that, it's its own server.js that does all of this kind of stuff, is that I would then have to implement mapping and all the debug stuff, all of the Sass and, less and stylus auto compilation. So I'm kind of cheating by just putting it in this way. So what this actually does is when I call grunt server here, it's using that call. So we see that Redis failed, so I need to actually launch that. So now it's using that server. Okay, so let's see what that server looks like. So it's called libserver. So I'm going to jump into libserver here. And this is where the meat of this talk is, why this is unique. So what I'm doing here is I'm launching Express, or I'm requiring it. I'm requiring Cheerio, which is that Node.js DOM implementation. And then I grab Backbone, which is already compatible inside of Node, and requirejs, which is compatible in Node. I'm creating my server. I'm including the API, which I'll show in a minute. And I'm attaching the API onto this server. I'm reassigning require globally to be requirejs. From now on, because in the browser, require is requirejs, but in Node, they have common.js, which is also called require. You would have to have some kind of weird conditional logic in every one of your modules. Don't do that. Just reassign the global after you've already gotten everything that you need out of it. After that, I'm redefining. So I'm redefining jQuery to now return Cheerio. So from now on, the rest of the application will always be referring to jQuery as Cheerio. And I'm redefining Prism to just return nothing. So now it's undefined and it won't be used on the server. If I keep going, I'm implementing, or I'm emulating, this is not the right word for this. I'm basically making it so code doesn't fail that is trying to use DOM events and DOM features. So hide, jQuery hide, and prototype on. I just make those return this. So it just keeps the chain going. Now I'm putting another require.config in here, and what this is doing, this is saying do not load the browser layout manager and do not load the Backbone layout manager. The reason why I'm doing that is that I have a special implementation of Backbone.layout manager that runs on Node, so we want to use the Node require. Requirejs will automatically, if it does not find a browser implementation, it will fall back to the Node implementation. So this is really useful. So now I can take both of these, make them so that they're loaded from Node, and then they'll actually share the same objects. So the Backbone.layout manager will share the same backbone that is loaded through Node as well. I have a comment here that explains exactly why that is. Okay, so let's kind of emulate that app config loading from the browser. I just do a simple require config. I wait till that's complete. I modify the Backbone history prototype start method so that it doesn't do anything with the browser. I modify the Backbone router prototype route so that now it's actually adding it to that express router that I created. This is way better, in my opinion, than having to reduplicate the exact same routing logic. I'm doing this thing here that's router.page.then at the end of the route. So I'm saying when the router page has finished rendering, then send the contents of the entire HTML within Cheerio. So I mentioned how I loaded index.html as like the document. I basically grab the root HTML and I can pump that down to the client. Before I keep going, just so that this doesn't look like magic here, I'm going to show you how that router page is attached. So when we get into the Backbone router, there's some setup that happens, but let's go into the drop function. I'm doing this.setPage, no magic, it's just saying that on the router there's a function called setPage. It accepts a name of a template, and it can take some subviews. So I'm putting in the navigation, and I'm putting in where that drop zone is. We look into set page. It checks to see, is there an existing page? If there is, remove all the subviews. We don't want to reduplicate things, and we want to make sure everything's collected properly. Save that layout. So that's where that page object comes from. So we're sharing the same router here. And we see that it is actually the render method. So I can chain off of that. So whenever render is actually returning a promise, and that's what that .then is. It's just a flow control. And I'm specifying a data layout here. This is used for CSS. And then I just return the page view here. So, but that's where that page object comes from. So let's just hop back into server. I'm requiring the main application. We're actually running it now. And then the last bit I'm doing is I'm modifying that display model sync method to pull from the API instead of making an asynchronous request. The last bit is just necessary for my grunt server. I just need to export that express server so that it's used within grunt. That's all that line is. So here we see that there's really not too much that's going on in my server abstraction, and we're running the exact app code. So the app code doesn't change based off of what environment we're in. It's only the environment overrides that get picked as features, and then the rest of the application just runs through. There's more stuff in here that's really sort of oriented towards a backbone boilerplate talk, not so much a client sharing talk. But feel free to like explore this repo and give it a shot. Let me show the API before I finish. So the API is simply running Redis. It has a UUID module so that it can actually create custom IDs based off of when you throw files into it. And then I just have these methods like getFileById, which I can then expose and then use within the server. So yeah, I threw a lot at you. The main takeaways here are write your application for the browser. Maybe think long-term about what it would be like to implement it on the server. So use good practice and good judgment. Use abstraction. Use a code library like Backbone. It doesn't have to be Backbone, but use something like that that helps you abstract away these core fundamental features, these base classes. From there, you can also start thinking about like abstracting the DOM and not using DOM methods directly. So yeah, that's the primary part of this talk. This application is functional. There's a few little bugs, as we saw, that can be cleaned up. But overall, the code does run seamlessly on the server and the client. This will help you make optimized applications. So like if I just do this grunt release, Redis server release, this is explained in the README, but effectively what this is doing is this is compiling the whole application into being as efficient as possible. It's running the Redis server, and it's going to be running using the release assets. So I talked about that virtual mapping. The virtual mapping will now know to use the release assets because I put that sort of colon release. It's going to use the sub property inside of the grunt config. So I'll run this right now. So this is uglifying. This is doing all that I discussed about how the file sizes change. And then if I go into the application on localhost 8000, we see how all these files are in here. When I hit refresh, it's only going to load one CSS file, one JavaScript file. It's going to be heavily optimized. So we see with gzip, it goes down to 50 kilobytes. And it's going to be using synchronous calls instead of asynchronous calls. So things happen very, very quickly. Thanks for listening to my talk. I'm glad you guys came to the TBD. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Okay, so there are questions. This is awesome. This is the first time I've had questions for this talk. So sure, let's start with you. Yep.
So when you did the different require syntax, where you don't use the array syntax, but you just pass as require.
Yeah.
Does our JS optimizer pick up on?
It does. Yep, it will toString inside of that function, find all the require calls, make sure that they're loaded before that function is called. Yep. Okay, so the question was, when I showed the common JS style of using the define function in requirejs, will the optimizer, so when I run that release method and it knows how to compile all the modules together, will it pick up on that, or do you have to do something special? You don't have to do anything special. requirejs will pick that up. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. What do you mean by synchronous calls?
Oh, okay. Yep, so when I do the unoptimized version of this application, so if I just run Redis server and I reload the page, everything is being loaded asynchronously. So it's actually going out and making an asynchronous request to fetch all of these files and make sure that they run. When you're using an optimized build, when you call require, it will just immediately already have access to that, so it's just much faster. You don't have any delay. The difference why you would do that is during development, it's nice to be able to see all of these files. Yeah, exactly. And one other point that I forgot to mention here, using the new backbone boilerplate stuff inside of here, when you're on a production build and you have that one file, let's say you have a bug or something like that, and there's one line here, you can't easily see what's going on. I provide source map support now, so that you can hop in here, go into the debug file. It's going to take a little bit to load because there's a lot in it. But here we have the complete uncompressed concatenated file. So, sure.
Is there a way to script server-specific code out?
No server-specific code is compiled into the production build. So that's actually a really good point. This was another problem that I had with AMD feature. AMD feature will bundle every single feature that you have defined, every implementation. That's not how mine works. Mine works by not bundling anything by default, and then based off of your specific needs, so inside of my requirejs spot here, I have the include, and I will only include the browser code that's necessary in the build file. So you have to manually specify what those includes are. That's a good question, thanks. Yep.
Thank you. And would you talk a little bit about why not split client from server and then also have a shared piece?
Oh, why wouldn't you just build your server application in your client server and then have something that kind of links the two?
Or take all the functions that are here, take all the functions that can be shared,
Uh-huh.
put them in one spot.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. So it's sort of like a middleman abstraction that you reference from both points. So the server will reference that, and the client will reference that. You could do it that way, but that kind of, it defeats the starting of building something just for the browser first. I mean, I guess you could think that way. That's exactly kind of my point about abstractions. You're just talking about another way of abstracting out your code. So that you could do that way as well. This was more of an approach of, I already have this kind of mindset and workflow for how I build applications, and I'm just layering that server bit into it. I think that's an equally valid way of writing something that's client and server. Yep. Anyone else? Oh, one more. Yep. Oh, we're cut off? I'll talk to you after the talk. Yep. Okay, great. Thanks a lot, guys. Cool.